Hello, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the United States Spiritist Federation, we are here again for our Spiritist Talks every Saturday at 11 a.m. And today, as always, we have a very special program for all of you. But before we start with our program, with our guest speaker, we would like to invite you all to follow us in a prayer. So we raise our thoughts, unite our hearts, asking for the guidance and protection, especially for our guest speaker today, Dan Assisi, so that we can benefit and take to heart everything that is going to present to us, that the good spirits, the benefactors, may be inspiring us and protecting us during this talk. So be it. So once again, let us introduce with great joy our dear friend Dan Assisi. Hello, Dan. Welcome. We cannot hear you.
Oh yeah, you figured that after 2 years I would learn how to unmute, right? If it's
Yeah,
still
well.
well, hello, thank you for having me, and hello to everybody who might be with us today.
Okay, so before we start, as always, we would like to introduce Dan, regardless whether you know him or not. It's been, he has been giving talks for so long and being with us, especially here in the US, our community. But still, we would like to introduce him. Dan Assisi is an award-winning author and internationally celebrated speaker who has delivered hundreds of talks and conferences on spirituality in over 60 cities on 4 continents. Known for a mix of deep thinking and wit, humor, Dan takes a unique approach to spirituality that is steeped in reason to remind audiences everywhere of our spiritual nature. Dr. Assisi is a member of the Spiritist Society of San Diego in California and is a founding member of the Spiritist Institute. And what is important for us to say as well is a very dear friend to us all, and we are very happy to have him here today to give this talk, this presentation to us. So the floor is yours, Dan.
Thank you so much, Josara. Thank you for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Please, all of you, receive my warm hug from the other side of our beautiful country. I'm out here in San Diego today. You might notice that it's a little bit dark. It's a little bit of a cloudy day here today, but I'm very excited to spend some time with you talking about change, talking about personal change. But before I start, I want to say hello to our friends who are watching us from many different places. It is a blessing to be able to be with you. I see Paula Craig from Indiana. I see JC, our great friend JC, all the way from the Philippines. How are you, JC? I see Flavia as well and many others. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here live with us. And if you're not live with us, and if you're watching this on replay, that's very okay too. We thank you for taking the time. It is truly a joy to be in community with people who are trying to make sense of the world through a spiritual lens, which is something that we try ourselves. So thank you for being here. Today, we are going to try to chat a little bit about change, about personal change. I think it goes without saying that these past years have really led us to rethink life, our purpose here, work, everything. And it's always very challenging to go through change. And so I often found myself talking to different people about how do we change both professionally and personally. How do we make sure that this world is a better world now than it was yesterday and tomorrow than it is today? So change has been a topic of conversation, and I dare say of contemplation for many of us for these past year and a half, 2+ years. So when faced with this question of how do we change and how does change happen, I thought about perhaps using a resource that some people have a little bit of problem with is some stories of the Bible. And that is because we still see the Bible in many different ways as a outdated document, as a book of religiousness that just tells us how to do things. But I see that differently. I see that slightly different. I leave aside all these ideas about the Bible and all the wonderful books it contains that I have received for other people. And I decided to check it out for myself. So today, I want to spend a couple of minutes with you revisiting a story, the parable of the lost son, sometimes called the prodigal son, through new eyes. My hope is that we can shed any religious perceptions or bias or inklings that we may have about the story or the book for an hour or so and think about it from a personal and spiritual perspective. So I want to read the story briefly with you, and I want to spend a couple of minutes analyzing it psychologically and spiritually to see if it may indeed enclose some tips for us on how we can change our lives. So what kind of process does change entail? And I say that not only on an individual level, I also say that in a collective level, because I think that many of us will agree that we have no doubt been thrown for a spin with COVID and this whole situation lately, right? But I think that we can also agree that society has changed too. And it's not just about us changing ourselves, but it's about making a better world. So I think that this story may have some tips and some insights on how we individually and socially can prepare for and act on change. And so I hope that you have a little bit of patience as we do this. So we are calling this one, When It's Time to Change, the Parable of the Lost Son. All right. So hang in there with me as I see that more people are joining. Thank you for being here as well. Thank you, Silva, Raquel, Brian, good to see you. Paul, good morning to all of you guys. So let's dive in. Okay, so this is going to be interesting because I'm going to do something here that normally I don't like doing very much, which is to read a little bit of the story, this parable, that I'm asking you to put any judgments that you have aside for a second. But before we do that, before we read a parable, I want to tell you where you can find it should you want to go and read it for yourself. And you can find it on the Gospel of Luke, which is one of the 4 stories about the life of Christ that we find in the New Testament, one of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this story, it's only found in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 15, which is a really interesting chapter. And it's only about 14, depends on how you want to look at it in general, like 14 to 20 different verses that are a little bit long, but they're worth reading because there's a wealth of information in there. I also want to say, just really briefly, that the interesting thing about this parable as well is that it is the 3rd story that we see in that chapter 15. And that chapter deals, these 3 stories, they deal with finding something that was lost. So I think that you have a spoiler alert there, that we are going to be talking about returning to our roots, returning to our spiritual origin, thinking about things from a spiritual perspective. And so chapter 15 of Luke really draws in this point that it is necessary to find what was lost, to go back to what is really important. And that's, I think, in many different ways, what we're trying to do during this pandemic, which is to reflect about how do we go back to a world without a pandemic? How do we make this a better place? So with all that in mind, I hope that I won't bore you to death. Feel free to interact in your comments. Put your comments in there. We'll try to address them. And if we don't address them during our talk, we'll have some dedicated time to talk afterwards if I don't get carried away and talk too much, which I promise I'll try not to. So thank you for being here. So let's dive in. Let's do that thing that I don't like doing very much, but I think that in this case is important. Let's read together a little bit of this story, this wonderful story. So I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to apologize in advance that it's going to be a little bit of text, but it's only about 20 verses or so, but we can do this together. All right, so let's do this. All right, so the story goes, to illustrate the point further, right? Jesus is having a conversation with people. So he goes, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there, he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am, dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father, the story goes, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring from his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. So the party began. But you may think that the story ends there, and it would be a good place to end the story, wouldn't it? Happy ending. However, there's more. Let's dive in a little bit more as well. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed a fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, All these years I have slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet, when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. His father said to him, Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found. All right. So that was a little bit of reading there, but I think that you get a gist of the story. I think you have heard this before as well. But if that's okay with you, I want to talk to you a little bit about this journey in a visual way so that we make sure that we hit a couple of important points on our way to diving a little bit deeper into what it could mean to us. So let me share my screen here. And let's look at the journey of the prodigal son, of this lost son. And the word prodigal, I think we might know this, just means wasteful, right? So let's look at how this journey begins. For the prodigal son, for the lost son, for the younger son, he begins where we all begin. He begins working at the farm of his father. But young age and entitlement maybe kick in a little bit, and he decides that one fine day, he doesn't want to work there anymore. He wants to go and discover the world. So what does he do? He asks his father to give him his inheritance even before his father is dead. Isn't that something? That's quite daring and quite, as I said before, entitled, isn't it? He says, I am too good for this. I want to do something else. Give me what is mine. He believes that his father's wealth is his already. And so he asks for that in advance. And surprisingly, the father says yes. And the father then divides his wealth between his sons, the older son and the younger son. And what does the younger son do with all that new resource, those new resources, with all that money? He packs his bags and he goes to a distant land. He goes far away from home, and he goes places where he can enjoy life to the fullest as he sees it. He eats the best food. He goes out with all the girls. He enjoys all the pleasures of life, and he's living for the moment, and he is seemingly enjoying himself. But eventually, what happens? He runs out of money because he's not really thinking about how to build things. He's thinking about how to enjoy things. And when he does, when he runs out of money, it just so happened that in that distant land, far away from home, he gets hungry. There is this famine. There is this lack of resources, of food, of nourishment, because everybody in that distant land is trying to do the same thing he does, which is just enjoy themselves. And in that moment, when he realizes that he's hungry, he's got to do something. He doesn't have things that he's backing anymore, does he? So does he decide to go home? No. He decides to stick it out and say, maybe if I get another job, I can go back to this life I had and enjoy myself. And so he goes and asks for a job around, but nobody will give him a job. Eventually, he knows somebody who will give him a job, and he gets a job feeding the pigs in a farm. And here's an interesting place for us to do a quick stop, because as you might remember, in the Judaico tradition, the pigs are unclean animals. They are the lowest of the lows. And his job then is to do the lowest of all the lowly jobs. And while he is doing that job, while he's feeding the pigs, which is a job that doesn't require a lot of skills because he doesn't have a lot of skills, right? He's just been enjoying life. He has not been working on himself. While he's feeding the pigs, he comes to a curious moment where he finds himself coveting or desiring those pellets, that food that the lowliest of the dirtiest pigs eat. And he realizes in that moment that when he was home, even the lowliest of his father's servants had better food and a better life than he had at this point in time. So something clicks, and he begins to come unto himself, which is a term that I love, as if he was outside of his own spiritual self. He returns to his roots a little bit, and he realizes that he should go home. And he wants to go home and beg his father to take him back, not as a son, because now he understands he's squandered all his money and resources and his father's trust. He hopes to go back and ask for forgiveness, so that he can work as a servant there at the farm where he first started. So tired, weary, and dirty, he makes his way back. He starts on the road back to where he started. And it's important for us to say that he has to walk the same road back. After all, if you went to that distant land, it's just not going to magically happen the next day he's back home. He's got to make the exact same way back. But something beautiful happens along the way. This is a really touching part of the story for me, I think. As he's making his return back to home, his father sees him coming at a distance. And that only happens because his father, we can surmise, has been waiting for his return all along. So he has been looking down the road for a while, hoping that his son will come home, as a father and a mother would do, wouldn't they? And so while he's not yet home, his father runs to him in the middle of the road, not waiting for him to come back, and hugs him. And then you know how it goes. We just read the story. The younger son apologizes and says, I'm sorry, I have sinned against you in heaven. I have not been a good son. Please take me as a servant. And what does the father do? The father says, no, I'm not taking you back as a servant. He asks his servants, bring me a cape, a sign of care and love, right? The red tunic, but also bring me shoes, sandals, and a ring. And those are very symbolic. The shoes being that in that time, and also in the Roman Empire, anybody with a shoe or a sandal was not a slave. Citizens had to wear shoes. So giving him shoes means I am restoring you to your status that you had before. I'm not treating you as a servant, but I'm treating you as one of my family. And the ring, I think we all know what a ring is. A ring is a sign of covenant, of connection, of betrothal, of being connected to each other in a fundamentally important way. And so his father gives him a cape, sandals, and ring to symbolize that he's happy to take him back. And so much so that when they get back to the farm, his father says to his servants, let's get the juiciest calf out there. Let's barbecue, right? Let's celebrate. Let's throw a party because my son who was lost has returned. Who was dead is now living. Beautiful words there. But the story, as we said, it doesn't end there, does it, friends? Because what else is also happening? We have the older brother. And when the older brother who's working from the fields comes back and sees there's a party going on, he doesn't go into the party. He asks somebody on the outside, what's happening? And one of the servants again says, your brother's back. Your father took your brother back. And he's taken by the moment of anger, of rage a little bit, so much so that he refuses to go in, and his father also has to come out and talk to him, much the same way the father went out on the road to receive his younger son. And he says, come to the party. And the other brother says, how can you do this? I have been slaving here for the whole time, and you have never given me even a smaller goat, which is much smaller than a calf, for me to celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, right? He doesn't even see the other brother as a brother anymore. He says, this son of yours is not my brother. This son of yours spends all his money on prostitutes and drugs and anything he can do. And you take him back like this? And the father says very lovingly, but son, I've always been with you and everything that I have is always yours. Come on, let's celebrate the fact that your younger brother has returned. So a nice little wrinkle that we're going to talk about. But I think you see here what we're talking about. And I think that this gives a little bit of a perspective of different stages that the younger son goes through. And that might be worth for us to kind of examine a little bit as we try to make sense of how this could apply to us. Right. So having taken that out of the way, let's dive in a little bit into what this could symbolize and mean for us. So to do that, I propose that we take a stab of looking at these different phases that the prodigal son or the lost son goes through. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So let's consider 6 different phases that our prodigal son goes through and how that can impact our lives. All right. So the first thing that we remember is that our son starts at the farm, right? And all of us, in many different ways, are starting at the farm as well. We all start from the spiritual world. We all start from reincarnating into our families. We all have a planned and lovingly start to this life. So once we are in that area, sometimes we don't realize all the blessings and all the work that has gone into preparing this life for us. We are sometimes caught wondering what it would be like to enjoy life, to enjoy the world without necessarily thinking about where do we come from, who we truly are. We get caught in all those scintillating promises of immediate pleasure, and we want to move away from the farm into a new world. But while we are in the farm and thinking about the farm, I wonder if we recognize the possibilities and the opportunities for growth that we have before us. So when we are in home base, have we thought about all the work that has been put by our spiritual benefactors in preparing this incarnation for us? Have we given any thought of the fact that we have everything that we need to fulfill and the learning that we need to do in this life? Have we given value to the circumstances in which we have come to this world? And have we sought to understand what truly is our home base? These are important considerations that that we ought to take into account. So that's one interesting thing that we can turn into our own perspective and start to ask ourselves on an individual level, where do I begin and why did I begin there? Because as Spiritists and understanding that there is reincarnation, we are uniquely prepared to think and ponder about why we started where we started in a different way, because we understand that we are spiritual beings first. So why did I start there? And how? And what lessons do I have to learn because of that? So that's one consideration that we can do or take into account as we begin to think about the symbolism behind the parable of the lost son and how we go about change. And the second one, I think you know very well, right? It's that thing that we all go through, which is the distant land. What is the distant land but a far away place from our beginnings? And I think that it would not be a stretch of the imagination for us to consider that we all leave home. We all leave this idea of spirituality, of being spiritual beings at one point in our lives, and go far away into this distant land that is nothing like the farm, that is nothing like our home base. We get trapped sometimes in the idea that the world is just here to fulfill our immediate needs and our pleasures and our sensual desires. And we try our best to enjoy everything that life can afford us from a sensory and sensual perspective here and now. We try to have as much pleasure as we can in physical life. We try to accumulate wealth because we think that is going to quench our thirst and fill our hunger. We try to get as much as what the eye can see because we think that there's the only thing that there is out there, the only thing that matters. We step on others to do that. We don't care about others' feelings as long as we get the fix that we are looking for. And so, what is this distant land of ours and how does it manifest? That's a great question. But more importantly, is how far away are we from God and our spiritual essence? Have we realized that we have wandered off the farm that we first started and got perhaps a little sidetracked with the worries of the world, which are important? But sometimes we give ourselves, more importance to these worries of the world as if they were the only thing that matters, to the discredit or to the harm of our spiritual selves. So this distant land could be this faraway place where we forget about who we are as spiritual beings, and we get trapped on taking our kids to school, making ends meet, paying the mortgage, buying a better or a bigger house or car, getting a promotion at work, and we put all our time, effort, heart, and minds into just doing this at the expense of considering our spiritual selves. But we know what comes next according to the story, doesn't it? At one point in time, as we are solely worried about making a pleasure out of thin air, of enjoying ourselves, hunger will come in when all of a sudden our resources are taken away. And the prodigal son finds himself squandering all his wealth, so to speak, and he doesn't have anything else. And then he feels this hunger all of a sudden. And of course, we're not talking about just physical hunger here, although that's very important as well. We're talking about the spiritual hunger. We're talking about the psychological hunger that some of us feel, because more and more, I think that many of us are realizing that just focusing on our professional careers, that just focusing on our physical lives, just focusing on getting ahead in life from a physical or material perspective has left us with a fundamental and not ignorable hunger in our spirit. So much so that so many people are thinking about whether they should change jobs because their jobs are not fulfilling them, if they should change cities and places. During the pandemic, we have seen so many people contemplating moving somewhere else because there is this void in their hearts and in their souls that we cannot address just with things from this distant land, just with food and partying and drugs and money and sensual pleasures. There is this fundamental essence of ours that requires nourishing, and that nourishing cannot and will not come from the distant land. And so what happens? We try to understand how is it that we can quench that hunger by trying to look for work. Isn't it interesting? We could at this point say, I should go back to the farm. But the prodigal son doesn't do that, does he? What does he do? He insists in finding a way of getting those resources so he can go back to the life of luxury and enjoyment that he had before. And sometimes I think we do that too. We do that too. We say, I'm going to keep at it because I want to go back to that good life that I think should come from the enjoyment of physical things. Not that it's wrong to enjoy physical things, but when you put all our desire and our emphasis just on that, then we'll continue to be in hunger. And so much so that eventually we may find ourselves also feeding the pigs, of doing work that does not fulfill us. So the symbolism of the pigs, it's a beautiful one because it reminds us that it's important to find work that sustain us not only from a material and physical perspective, but also from a psychological and spiritual work. And so we ask, as we think about the pigs, why does this work? Why is it that the things that we are doing in this lifetime are not fulfilling us? If you find yourself asking yourself the question, so maybe you are in the middle of this journey too. And if we do, then what do we do about it? Because you can change lives, you can change works, you can change professions. But if that feeling is following you around, in which you may think that you are not doing that which you think you should be doing, or you don't feel like there's purpose and meaning to your life, then maybe we need to reevaluate. Maybe we need to what? Come unto ourselves. And that is the fundamental question that I think is it's falling upon our ears in this point in time of our common history. When will we go back to our essence? When will we realize that we're not just here to feed the pigs and to work in somebody else's farm so that we can barely make ends meet? Because in that distant land, everybody is starving because nobody takes care of each other. So when will we come into ourselves and say, oh my goodness, I have lost track, or we have lost track together, that we are spiritual beings who are temporarily endowing a physical body for the purposes of evolution, as we have learned constantly through Spiritism. When will we return to the idea that we are spirits first and physical bodies second? We are a spirit who is temporarily incarnated in this plane of existence to learn important lessons, and not physical bodies that have a spirit that would only manifest itself after we die. That's a fundamental difference that's very subtle in understanding, but very impactful in the way that we behave and lead our lives. Are we coming closer to coming unto ourselves and thinking that we have to make substantial change in our lives, leave behind this distant land to return back to our origins, which are spiritual in nature? And that leads us to one more piece of contemplation here, the return. And I think the question that beckons us is, how long will the way back be? Because the truth is that the road itself, it's always the same road that we took to move away from ourselves, or our inner selves, our spiritual selves, our origin, will be the way that we have to track back. But the good news is, as you have seen before, is that along the way, we are going to run into God, who's always waiting for us. But we need to make the decision We need to make that choice and say, this fundamental set of choices that I have taken or created for myself are not fulfilling my spirit. I need to go back and find a different way of returning to my spiritual self. Maybe I need to prioritize my understanding of who I am truly in essence. Because once we do, we begin to see life slightly different. We no longer worry as much about jobs, promotions, status, wealth. We begin to worry more about, are we developing? Are we happy? Are we growing virtues? Are we developing new skills? It is a very important shift in mindset because it is about us with ourselves and not about what other perceive us to be or whether we are ahead or behind other people. Because, see, in this story so far, we haven't really heard about anybody else, have we? To this point, it is all about the prodigal son. And in many different ways, that's how we behave too. We're just worried about ourselves. We're not really worried about anybody else's hunger. We're not really worried about any else's feeding the pigs. We're so intent fulfilling our needs and our egos and our desires that we can only think of ourselves. But when we begin to make our way back, when we begin to take on that mantle, that sandal, and that ring again from our father or mother, whichever way you want to see it, that embraces us back, we begin to see that we are not alone in the story. Isn't it so? And in fact, before we talk about that a little bit further, let's return to this idea of the phases of the prodigal son, because if we want to, we can also make a parallel to the times that we live in. You see, in a roundabout way, many of us have been wanting to go back to this pre-COVID world and thinking, you know what? It would be so much better if we could just go back to what we're doing before. But the truth is, going back to the way we were before is kind of like going back to that distant land again. We are now in a moment of collective hunger when we are asking ourselves, how come we are not fulfilled with the world? How come we are bubbling internally as a society, trying to understand what's going on? How come we're talking about this fact that many people are quitting their jobs? We sometimes call that, right, the great resignation. There's even a term in the business world where a lot of companies and organizations are worried about all these people quitting their jobs because they realize they don't want to do that job anymore. Some actually prefer the term the great realignment, which I like too. There is this common cloud of reflection that seems to be hovering over our collective heads that is empowering us to reflect about what is it that we truly want. So as a society, I wonder if we weren't also making a trek to this distant land for this past couple of centuries or more, where we have forgotten that we are spiritual beings and we have insisted on trying to solve our hunger by going out into the material world and getting as much pleasure as we can from whatever it is that we can find. And we have found out that it is not enough to quench our hunger, is it? We have seen people who apparently have it all. They are beautiful, they are rich, they are famous, and yet they are not fulfilled. They're not happy. And oftentimes they have severe mental health issues because of the pressure that was put on them, or they even try to commit suicide. And we wonder, how could it be that somebody who seems to have it all from a distant land perspective is not happy? And we realize that no matter our station in life, we might all be feeding the pigs as a society. We might be all insisting of just trying to get the satisfaction that comes from things, from having and not being. And so in this moment of reflection, I wonder if this is the time for us as a group, as a society, to come into our senses and realize that going back to a pre-COVID world, going back to a pre-COVID society, doesn't mean happiness. Because I think we can agree that the world wasn't really great to begin with. I mean, not everybody was really having a great time in the pre-COVID world. As we think about the challenges that the world was facing, racial inequity, hunger, discrimination, and all these kinds of things, economic injustice, health issues, all that was there to begin with. So just going back to our lives how it was before is tantamount to just trying to find a job and feeding the pigs and hoping that we can continue to live our lives in the distant land. But can we? Not so much. I think the story tells us that we need to go back to our source. This is a time of reflection for all of us, or could be, whether we want to really stay the course, insist on a life and a model that has not worked for us and for those around us, or whether we are willing to take a stab, to take a chance into trying something new, trying to make sure that we return home to be really welcomed by God, our spirituality, ourselves. And so, at the risk of talking too much, right, I'm going to stop here briefly. I'm going to do a little shift and ask another fundamental question that's important for us. Because until this point, like a good prodigal son or daughter, we have been thinking about ourselves. And that's good to do that. But let's shift perspectives ever so slightly and ask ourselves an important question we should always ask whenever we are interpreting any story. And in this case, we may ask ourselves, well, who are we in this parable? Are we the prodigal son? Are we the elder son? Are we the father? And to do that, I have this wonderful picture, first of all, from the artist Rembrandt that is found in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And it's a beautiful picture, really well detailed. I'm going to try to zoom in here a little bit so you can see. In this picture, you see something that is really beautiful. It's kind of like a spiritual analysis and interpretation of the parable. If you look carefully, you can see there in the, right here in the middle, we have the father welcoming the prodigal son coming back. And you can see that he's tattered, he's dirty, right? But look how interesting. The so-called father, look at his hands. Can you see that on the side of the screen over here? Look, he has one male hand, like stronger, and one feminine hand, so to speak, as if to symbolize that it's not just about, right? It's not about father or male dominance here, because we know that society back in the day was even more chauvinistic than it is today. So it makes sense to use the example of men, but this is not just about men. In fact, here on top, if you look carefully, there is a female figure, like the mother, kind of watching over as well. And you can see here as well, the older brother, right, is not so happy with the return. He's also donning the red mantle of power, right, which we see here with the father as well. And he's looking down on his brother and saying, why are you back? And there's all these other witnesses looking around. And I say that because it's always great for us to look into who we are in that story. So it's only normal that we think of ourselves as the prodigal son. And I think that's a very important take to it. But I also wonder if it might not be interesting for us to also raise the question that we could also at times be the older brother who might not be happy with the return of other people. Why do I say that? Because the older brother, you might recall, he is not happy with the return of his younger brother. He thinks he's in a better place than his younger brother. He doesn't want his father to pay attention or take back the other younger brother, especially since he's been working so hard. You see, the older brother about growth in many different ways. The older brother in this moment, it's really about himself too, in a different way than the younger brother. He still wants to think of himself not as in the same level of others, but he thinks of himself as better than his younger brother, to the point that he doesn't want his father to even associate with those older people. Isn't that curious? And he thinks he has been wronged when attention is put into those who need it most. But he has not been wronged, because you remember in the beginning of the story, when the father gives the younger brother his inheritance, The story is clear. It says the father divides his wealth with his sons. So the older brother has also received his fortune. But for him, it's not enough to have enough. It is important to have more than the other brother. And so I wonder if sometimes we also don't behave that way. If also we are unforgiving towards others. Because you see, in a roundabout way, we could say that this story is about forgiveness. Forgiveness to self and forgiveness of others. Forgiveness of self is exemplified by the story of the lost son himself, who has to come into himself and realize that he's made mistakes and he's got to make the way back. And that is forgiving our own actions and making our way back home. And forgiveness unto others is also about the older brother who has been working in the field, but his heart is not yet at a point where he can easily forgive those who perhaps have not behaved just like him, who have not stayed and tend the farm. And so I wonder if there's space for us to be both people and ask ourselves whether we are forgiving ourselves enough and others as well, or whether we are falling just on one side of the equation. We need to be both. And I would go further and say, and what if we can also embody the idea of being that father or mother? We can also play that role when we forgive those that act either way, and that we are also constantly on the lookout for those who are near to us, who perhaps are making choices that are not the best, and are ready to take them into our hearts and homes once they make their way back, or to go out of the party to talk to those who perhaps might be disgruntled with the behavior of others. That is an important conjecture, I think, for us to take to heart. We can also play that role of father, of mother, of mediator, making sure that all our people are safe, known, seen, and valued. That's an important consideration for us in these times, because we are so intent these days of either taking care of ourselves or blaming other people that we forget that we need to embrace them. And in this time of COVID, I think it's a great time for us as a society to take those messages and imprint them onto our souls. We need to be more forgiving and more merciful to ourselves and the mistakes that we have done. And we also have to be kind and considerate to others. Yes, perhaps some people may not have made great choices when it came to their actions during this time, but we can also take them home because we are part of the same family. And that is something that we ought to remember no matter the circumstances. We're seeing way too many families splitting because of politics and challenges, and none of that is needed. We all need to come home. But more important than really what has happened in the past, and as we look forward as immortal spirits that need to continue to develop and grow, is what is it that we are going to do moving forward? And that is the question that hovers over us. What we would do from here on? What choices are we going to make that fundamentally change our lives for the better? Because we are never alone, friends. And we are reminded of this in the beautiful words of our older brother, the Christ, who symbolizes as well, right, as the Father in that figure, if you want to think about God, who says in the end of this parable, very beautifully, and I want to bring this back because I think it's a wonderful sentence, a couple of verses, 2 verses actually. He says, the Father says to the younger brother, as if God was speaking to us, which can happen through our understanding of the beautiful teachings of Christ. It says, son, daughter, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day of other people returning, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he's found. Because if you think about it, coming to our senses, spiritually speaking, coming back to ourselves and realizing that we are immortal spirits and not just physical beings, really is coming back from the dead. from the dead that do not pay attention to the things that are really important and just walk every day like zombies in life without purpose or meaning. Coming back from a life of over importance onto the things that will not last, to realize that the things that we really can take with us are the things of the Spirit. When we make that shift, it is as if life changes completely. Life continues to be the same, but our perspective of the world changes. We are no longer of the world, we are in the world, temporarily speaking. And that's something that we have been able to really study and glean through a more systematic approach of studying Spiritism. Because from the beginning, Spiritism has reminded us that there is life after life. Spiritism was born out of the investigation of these phenomena that were really happening because the spirits of those who had inhabited Earth before us were trying to call our attention that they were still there. And so through that investigation, we have arrived at this beautiful body of knowledge that teaches us that constant communication with the spiritual world is not only possible, but also a reality. So we today, Spiritists, carry on this mantle, put on these sandals, and put on this ring because we understand that the spiritual world is not something that happens after we die. It's something that happens all the time. It's something that we live in. And if that is the case, why not think about it more often? Why is it that we don't spend more time thinking about ourselves as spiritual beings? I currently am joking quite a bit about this, but it dawned on me that I might spend more time in this life brushing my teeth, because I do that twice a day for 2 minutes, for a total of 4 or 5 minutes a day, than actually thinking about myself as an immortal being. But the truth is, I don't stop being an immortal being because I'm not thinking about it. I am constantly a spirit. And so I wonder if it's time for me to go back to the farm, to make that trek back towards the Father and the Mother, and realize my spiritual essence really is what is at place here, is at stake here, and what really I should care about, because that, tending to the things of the Spirit, that is what will satisfy that hunger that I feel within me. And so socially, I think the same way. I wonder if as society, if we take a step back and realize that this is an opportunity for reflection, we can really arrive at that understanding, because love is there for us at its promise in the parable. The Father is always looking down the road, waiting for us to return and not let us do those last steps by ourselves. And that is quite a powerful understanding, quite a powerful piece, isn't it? Because the love that we build here, now that we know that life goes on after this lifetime, goes on in the spiritual world as well. We don't stop loving those who have gone before us, do we? And so why is it that we think that they stop loving us? They continue to love us. We just don't remember it. But we got to come back to our senses to remember that not only those who have shared a lifetime with us are still loving us, even if they have discarnated, but those who have shared lifetimes with us before, because now we know of reincarnation, those also continue to love us. So the truth is, there is an overwhelming sea of love that is always directed to us at all times, and that we are unaware. Isn't that beautiful? Spiritism brings that realization to heart when we put two things together, that life goes on and there is reincarnation. We're also forced to realize that we have an incredible number of friends, family members, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, colleagues from previous lives and this one, who continue to cheer us on. So let's cheer each other on as well. And let's help each other in this journey towards a better future, because it is through our own individual actions, if all of us do our little bits into becoming better people, that our world will transform itself too. And in this moment of COVID, when we're wavering so much about what is it that will happen next and what is it that the world should look like, maybe we can take to heed this framework that this ancient story found in the Gospel of Luke 2,000 years ago can give us. And those insights are clear. There is a change that's happening, and there is a road to change. And if we are anxious about what is next, Now we know the steps that take place. And we also have some pieces of insight for us to kind of reflect on and realize that we are in that story. And so we ask ourselves, who are we in the story, when and how? And that gives us something to hold on as we look forward and begin to realize that it's time to change. We all must change because that is what we do all the time. So let's do it. Let's change it together. And I hope that the lost son, the older son, and the younger son may also stay with you in this Saturday and give you fodder for reflection so that you may find the joy that you are seeking and will arrive at, because the hunger that sometimes all of us feel is temporary. So let's go back home. Let's go back to the farm and hope that we can continue to grow in understanding and in love and in the practice of love through our study of these beautiful messages, but also of the great messages that we have every week in our Spiritist centers, in our Spiritist books, and our Spiritist content. So thank you for your time. I'm going to stop talking here and see if perhaps we have some questions from our friends who have been so patiently listening.
Thank you so much, Dan. You brought us so much food for thought. It's amazing how rich the parables of Jesus are, and the actuality and everything that we can refer to in relation to the times that we are living, and the need that we still do to take this and to be able to have the courage to assume and to take the same journey. So thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. And yeah, we do have a few questions. Let's start with the first one from Paul. Hi, Paul. Isn't the older son of the journey too? He hasn't yet gone to the distant land to let experience clarify him. Isn't fear often the issue that prevents us from moving forward?
Wow, what a great question, Paul. I am in full accordance with what you say. I definitely think that for us to understand that journey, we have to look at both the young son and the old son. And sometimes we only see the young son because that sticks with us. But I agree, the older son is on the journey too. He too has gone, in my opinion, to a distant land. The difference is that his distant land is not that distant geographically. He's still at the farm, but his heart, it is on the journey. And that is an important piece because he is close to his father. He's doing his work, but he still has work to do himself in accepting others. He's also in that journey. He's also trying to make sense with the world and find pleasure and satisfaction for himself. He too, we can say, is hungry, right? For acknowledging and acceptance from his father. And so they are all in their journey, the two of them. They're just in slightly different paths, but the journey is sort of the same, as you can see. And isn't it beautiful that if you think about it, and see, this is how these stories, as Josara was saying, are so beautiful because there's just so much symbolism. Isn't it beautiful that the father goes into the middle of the road to find the lost son who's coming back? And the father also goes outside of the party, right, at the house, to go get the older brother who also refuses to come in. Isn't that interesting? The father, our choice, evolution, love, whatever it is that you want to call it, it's always coming to us, embracing us. And that is the beauty of love and our superior spirits who aid us. So yes, I totally agree with you, Paul. The older brother is also in the journey. And both of them together, the younger brother and the older brother, afford us different perspectives to the same journey of forgiveness and growth that we need to do. We need to forgive ourselves and return home from a physical perspective, an emotional perspective. But we also want to be forgiving and should be forgiving of others and let them come home as well and help them come home. And here's the difficult thing for most of us: celebrate them coming home. Why is it so hard sometimes for us to celebrate the success of others? Why is it that sometimes we feel subconsciously, perhaps, that if we celebrate others, we are not celebrating ourselves? And nothing could be farther from the truth, because the Father wants to celebrate both children, and we're all children. So the moment that we begin to celebrate the success of others is the moment that we know that we have become more comfortable for with whom we are, because we don't want to have those moments of the older brother, right? Where to feel better about ourselves, we have to downgrade or downplay other people, because that's what he wants to do, isn't it? He wants to feel better about himself by putting his friend, his brother down to such an extent that he denies even being a brother in the story, right? He goes back to the father and says, "That son of yours," right? As in, like, I have nothing to do with him. And so there's a lot of wisdom in the older brother there. And I think that actually we could spend a lot of time talking about the older brother, because we too are the older brother at times. And we are certainly in the journey. So I love that your awareness there, Paul. I am wholeheartedly in agreement with you. Both of them are in the same journey. They're just coming from different perspectives, but the journey remains the same.
Thank you, Daniel. We have, okay. As we act as the prodigal son, and in other instance as the older son, proud of his act and judgmental, I wonder which aspect is more difficult to become aware of it and to change.
Hello, Yasko. Great to see your smiling picture there. That's exactly how I imagine and picture you, by the way, with a beautiful smile. Um, Great question. And that's great wondering. I think that has to happen at an individual level, right? Because I think that for some of us,
Mhm.
self-forgiveness, the path of the lost son, might be harder than forgiving others. But I think that for others, forgiving others is a lot harder than forgiving ourselves. And so I think it's up to us to figure it out who we are in the story, because I don't think that we are also one dimensional. I think there might be moments in our lives or types of challenges that present themselves in which we might behave more like the lost son than the older son. And there might be other circumstances in which we behave or act more like the older son, who is unforgiving of others, than the lost son, who is still seeking for forgiveness himself. So I think that is the beauty of this story, is to give us this framework in which we can figure out where is it that we fit. And we also want to give ourselves permission to not think of us as fixed entities, because we are constantly changing. So I would not be surprised if in some parts of our life we struggle more and identified more, right, as the prodigal son, and in other parts we identify more as the older brother. And I think there will be different kinds of learning that. But I love your question, because that's a very important question for us to reflect on a daily basis. What's harder for us? That might be a telltale sign of things that we need to work on. What's ahead of us? So great thinking, great questioning there, Yasko. Thank you for bringing that to us.
Okay, and the next one is from Glausio. We are always getting lost and having to find our way back to the path of righteousness. What is the best way for us to bring out our inner father and accept who we are?
Glaucio, great question, my friend, because you remember you remind us of something that I did not explicitly comment, but could very well be said. What is to say that this story, right, this return to the farm, happens only once? Maybe we might find ourselves doing mini trips all over our lives in different points and times, right? So I think that the trick is to remember where is it that we belong and where is it that we came from. If we can hold ourselves to that idea, my opinion is that it'll be easier for us to make our way back. If we remember that we are spiritual beings, immortal beings created by love, right, by God, for growth and prosperity, spiritually speaking, then it becomes easier for us to assess where we are and make our way home if we have veered off the path. And I think that sometimes we do. Sometimes we are not paying attention. We're driving our cars and we take the wrong turn, right? But we know where we're going and where we're coming from. It's easier for us to correct that course, right? To let our internal GPS tells us to recalculate the path and go back. And that's why I love Spiritism so much, because it brings to us every single day every single time that we pick up a Spiritist book or listen to a Spiritist talk, is that there's spirits involved. And that's a reminder that we are spirits too. And that's why I think that this gift, it's called Spiritism, is so powerful, at least in my life, because it peels the curtain away from that which we already knew, but kind of were in doubt. The fact that we are spirits and that the spiritual world is in constant communication with the physical world. And if that's the case, how can we ignore it? And if we can't ignore it, we have to act on it. We have to start to begin. We have to begin to act and think spiritually first. We should start to guide our actions not by what Dan, the physical personality, wants here and now, but what is it that Dan, the spirit, wants for himself and others in the long term. It takes time to make that change, right? It takes time to go back that road back home, because it took us time to get here. It will take us time to go back, but it is possible. And what a joy it is to go back there. So if we can hang on to that idea that we're spirits first, my friend, I think that we're halfway there. And that's at least what I'm telling myself, and I'm holding myself to it.
Wonderful. I think we still have another question, the last one. Who is the son that stayed behind? Who does he represent?
Yes, right? And so this is an interesting piece. That's the older brother, right? The son that stayed behind. Mm-hmm. Here's the interesting piece, though. Did he stay behind? He didn't really stay behind, does he? I mean, he stays behind in the perspective of the son that went out. But if you think about it, the son that went out actually was the one that moved away from the perspective of the son that stayed behind. So it's really about perspective. And I think that I find the son that stayed behind, the older brother, very interesting, because he's still doing the work, we're told in the story. He's still helping the farm. He's still growing. And even while he's doing that, he's still struggling with finding his emotional, spiritual way to his father. Isn't that interesting? You can be doing the right work. You can be doing the right tasks with the right intention and still struggle with what you're doing. Because it's easy for us to look at the prodigal son and say, well, he's definitely not doing what he's supposed to be doing. So I understand why he's struggling, right? But when we look at the older brother, I find him more interesting, to be honest, in the story, because he's on the side a little bit. He doesn't get a lot of the attention until the end. And sometimes that part of us doesn't get that much attention either from ourselves. But it is okay for us to struggle with the feelings, even when we're doing the right thing. It is okay for us to volunteer and help the world become a better place and still struggle and have questions about it. We're still going to be loved and accepted. So in many different ways, I think that the older brother resonates with me very powerfully, because it's about us paying attention to that which is not always at the forefront of our existence. How is it that we are presenting ourselves? Are we taking time to reflect on whether the actions that we are doing are really aligned with that which we want? And if we are struggling, that's okay too. And I think that's a beautiful piece for us to think about. So I love those questions. And thank you for bringing those questions about the older brother, the brother that stayed behind, because I think that without him, the story is not as powerful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm always also very intrigued with the old son, and I think the perspective that you brought to us is really important, because in many cases that's what some of us are trying to do, right? We already know, we're already there, but
exactly, and we still slide, right? We still struggle with it a little bit. So we still step on a banana peel, right? Yes, very well said.
Okay, I think this is the last question we have. Thinking about the Sermon on the Mountain and the stages that it represents, could we say that the first step he had to take for the return was to become poor in spirit?
Oh, I love those connections, right? So we're letting our synapses fire here and make connections with other wonderful teachings that can also be understood so well when we take away this varnish of religion and dogma that sometimes comes when we bring the word Bible or religion to place, right? So I love that we are giving ourselves permission to think of this wonderful book, the Bible, and the teachings of the Christ, especially the New Testament, which I love, in a different way, like rediscovering it in many different ways, right? Because at the end of it, I'm going to get on the soapbox here for a quick second. At the end of it, I think that if I were to rename the Bible today, I would call, especially the New Testament, I would call it the Book of Change, because the entire book, it's about how do we change and how does change take place and how do we grow. And so the Sermon on the Mount is perhaps the apex of all those teachings of how we can behave and look at the world. And I think it's really best understood when we have the aid of Spiritism that clarifies so many things to us, especially this idea that we are not our physical bodies and that we, our consciousness, who we truly are, our spirit, we like to call it, will outlive our physical body. So when we begin to think about it this way, it makes complete sense for us to come onto ourselves back, which is a sentence that sometimes we find very often in the New Testament, as exemplified by the Sermon on the Mount. To be poor in spirit in many different ways, as exemplified by the sermon, is to come onto ourselves and realize that what we need to be happy is not that many things. It's not really things of this physical world, but is to know who we are and that the relationships that we have and the people that we love are always going to be with us. We do not need much to be truly happy. We just have made this story in our heads that we need a lot of things to be happy, but we don't. We don't need a new house. We don't need a lot of cars. We don't need a lot of money. We just need our consciousness to be in peace with self by doing the right thing and having that sense of love and affection and acceptance around us. So I would love to be poor in spirit one day. Maybe it will take me quite a bit of time, but that's the end goal, isn't it? To want less and just be really happy with what we have, or sometimes what we call an attitude of gratitude. Just be there, knowing that you are enough the way you are and that you have everything, as the parable tells us, everything that you need to be successful and happy, because we have everything that is God's, because we're God's children. So I love how we are bringing back to the Sermon on the Mount and bringing the poor in spirit, which is a term that sometimes is hard to understand, but that can be made more easily accessible to us and to our minds when we begin to think spiritually and realize that we don't need stuff to be happy. We just need to be, right? We are human beings. We're not human doings or human heavens. We just have to be. And that's a beautiful piece that the passage reminds us of.
Great. Thank you so much. And then I think we come to the end of our presentation today. We have some comments, excellent teaching today. I see myself as both brothers, but more so the other son as looking into a conversation I just had yesterday. Sure woke me up. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paula. Amazing presentation, Dan, from Lucas. And we could be both in different time. Yes, and thank you for such a fantastic presentation. So much to think about. Nice lecture and Q&A. Thank you. And so many others. Great reflection on how to apply all of this. So then we would like to invite you to do the closing for us. With your prayer. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. Please, all friends out there in the virtual world, feel our gratitude for your time spent with us here today, in this community, in this road, along with all of us who are attached and following and working with the United States Spiritist Federation, who's bringing this to us. So in this moment, I'm going to invite you to join me in a moment of gratitude, where we are going to raise our thoughts up high and say, thank you, God, for giving us this inner resource that reminds us when we tap into it that we are children of God. And so we ask that we may feel it and not just know it in our hearts, that we are going to be okay no matter what, no matter the circumstance in life that we go through. May we be reminded by ourselves, by you, God, and by those around us that we are immortal spirits and that we will overcome any challenge that is placed our way in this road, whether we sometimes struggle with challenges that come from being lost in the road, or whether sometimes we struggle with challenges of not knowing whether we are doing the right thing, even if we're close to home. So thank you for being with us and constantly giving us examples and resources that we can go back to and reflect on and learn how to best make choices for ourselves. And thank you, first and foremost, God, for letting us make those choices for ourselves. Thank you for loving us so much as to allow us to even make choices that are not the best to us, such as leaving the farm or staying in the farm and thinking about things that perhaps are not the best. We are so grateful for everything that we have, and we're so grateful for all our friends, incarnate and discarnate, who have been here with us today and will continue to be along the road. Thank you, and I hope that we can continue to remind ourselves of who we truly are. Amen.